The air in the new apartment was thick with the scent of fresh paint and old dust, a combination that Seraphina found strangely comforting as she wrestled the last box into the living room, collapsing onto a stack of cushions with a tired sigh. It was a charming, if slightly neglected, top-floor unit in a century-old building, all creaking hardwoods and strangely angled ceilings. Her life had felt stuck for too long, a paused film reel, and this move was meant to be the unpause button, the clean slate she desperately needed. She spent the first day unpacking essentials, ignoring the non-essential clutter, driven only by the primal need for coffee and a shower. It was in the small windowless bathroom, illuminated by a harsh, single overhead bulb, that she first encountered the mirror. It was old, wide, and framed in dark, pitted wood, hanging low over the sink. She glanced into it, seeing the smudges of travel grime on her face, and reached out to wipe them away. But as her fingers touched the cool glass, a flicker caught her eye, a shift in the reflection that was utterly impossible. It was momentary, perhaps less than a second, yet vivid. The reflection staring back at her was not wearing the paint-stained hoodie she had on, but a sleek, midnight blue cocktail dress, her hair swept up in a sophisticated knot, and she was laughing, head thrown back in genuine, carefree joy. The background was different too, not the peeling wallpaper of the bathroom, but a shimmering room full of soft gold light and indistinct, celebrating faces. Then, just as suddenly, the image snapped back, showing only the tired, grubby Seraphina in her actual, present reality. She blinked hard, rubbing her eyes, convincing herself that it was the exhaustion, the strange lighting, or perhaps just a trick of the old glass. Mirrors in old buildings did that sometimes, didn't they? They warped the light, played tricks on the mind. She dismissed it as a hallucination born of caffeine withdrawal and 48 hours of moving heavy boxes, rinsing her face quickly and vowing to ignore the strange anomaly until she had slept a full night. The second time it happened, 2 days later, she was less tired and decidedly more alert. She was brushing her teeth, staring idly at her own image, when the background of the reflection fractured again. This time she wasn't laughing or in a beautiful dress. She was standing in the exact same spot, wearing the exact same clothes, but the expression on her reflected face was one of sheer terror, eyes wide and fixed on something just over her own shoulder, something outside the frame of the mirror that her actual present self couldn't see. Her reflected mouth was open in a silent scream, and as Seraphina watched, frozen with the toothbrush halfway to her mouth, a dark, heavy shadow lunged across the reflected scene, and the reflection shattered into a million tiny, glinting pieces of glass, though the actual mirror remained perfectly whole and solid before her. Seraphina dropped the toothbrush with a clatter, the sound echoing loudly in the small space. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was no trick of the light. This was a vision, a disturbing flash of a possible future, and the sheer terror on her reflected face was too real to be anything else. She slowly backed out of the bathroom, leaving the light on, her mind racing with a mix of disbelief and cold dread. Over the next week, the visions became a daily occurrence, a twisted, silent broadcast from a future that seemed to be actively unfolding parallel to her present. They were quick, often lasting only a few heartbeats, but they were detailed enough to be undeniable. One vision showed her spilling a full cup of scalding tea on herself, a minor but painful accident. She watched the reflection, noting the exact chipped blue mug she was using in the vision and the loose rug that caught her foot. When she later went to make tea, she instinctively chose a different, stable white mug and carefully removed the loose rug from the pathway. The spill did not happen. A small, chilling victory, and the first moment she truly understood. The mirror was not showing her an unavoidable future. It was showing her a potential one, a danger she could potentially circumvent. The mirror was a warning, a silent prophet of consequence. The more she paid attention, the more the visions intensified, moving from minor mishaps to genuinely frightening scenarios. One morning, the mirror showed her walking down the busy street outside her building, only to have a large, heavy planter fall from a window ledge, shattering precisely where she was standing in the reflection. She recognized the striped awning and the specific timing, early afternoon, when the sun hit the sidewalk just so. That afternoon, She deliberately took the alleyway, crossing the street far before the building with the striped awning, her palms sweating with anxiety. When she circled back later, she saw an ambulance and police tape around the exact spot where the planter lay, already cleaned up, but the lingering chalk outline and the disturbed pavement were chilling proof of the danger she had just narrowly avoided. She was changing the future, one heart-stopping step at a time, but the effort was exhausting, a constant, draining vigilance. She found herself sleeping poorly, jumping at every creak of the old building, her mind constantly running simulations, desperately trying to map out every possible contingency for the dangers the mirror might next broadcast. The apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a high-stakes, inescapable surveillance room, the mirror a tireless warden. Her attempts to avoid the reflection were futile. She tried covering the mirror with a thick velvet blanket, securing it with heavy-duty tape. The texture of the velvet was meant to be soothing, the thickness of the material an absolute physical barrier. She checked the seal twice, ensuring not a sliver of glass was exposed. But when she returned an hour later, the blanket lay on the floor, the tape peeled back cleanly, and the glass stared back at her, blank and waiting. It was as if the mirror itself had gently rejected the covering, finding the interference unacceptable. She tried unscrewing the mirror from the wall, testing the ancient-looking bolts, but it was set into the plaster with ancient, impossible fixings that wouldn't budge. The wood frame was fused to the wall, solid and immovable, a fixed point in her chaotic new life. It was anchored, a foundational element of the apartment, perhaps even of the building itself, and her feeble attempts to displace it only served to amplify her feelings of helplessness and entrapment. The mirror seemed to demand to be watched, to be acknowledged, and the more she resisted, the more aggressive the visions became, shortening the timeline from days to hours, and then terrifyingly to mere minutes. The psychological toll of this forced confrontation was immense. She started avoiding water, avoiding leaving the bathroom light off, feeling a growing, suffocating dread that the mirror was now not just showing her future, but actively drawing it toward her. The true panic set in when the mirror showed her a vision of a house fire. Not her apartment, which was usually the focus, but the one directly across the hall, the home of old Mr. Henderson, a sweet, slightly absent-minded man who always had a kind, if sometimes confusing, word for her. The reflection showed thick, suffocating smoke billowing into the shared hallway, flames licking violently at the old wooden door of his unit, and herself gasping for breath, trapped by the intensity of the blaze just outside her own unit. The heat radiating from the reflected image was so acute, she felt a phantom warmth on her face, and she could already smell the smoke in the bathroom right now, a phantom acrid scent that made her eyes water, even though the air outside was still and clear. She looked at the reflected wall clock. It was 10:47 p.m. The fire, in the mirror, was fully underway at 11:05 p.m. She had less than 20 minutes to avert a tragedy, a near-impossible task given the speed of fire in an old wooden structure. Seraphina knew she couldn't just stand there and watch the seconds tick down, knowing what was coming. She ran out of the bathroom, her adrenaline spiking, and frantically tried Mr. Henderson's door. She knocked softly at first, a civilized, neighborly knock, but when there was no answer, she escalated quickly, hammering on it, shouting his name. "Mr. Henderson, are you all right? It's Seraphina, please answer." But the silence inside was heavy and unresponsive. She grabbed her phone, calling emergency services, reporting a potential fire in the building, giving them the address and the specific unit, her voice trembling with urgency. But she knew the minutes were too precious. She needed to act, not just wait for the cavalry. She threw open her own apartment door, looked across the hall, and everything was normal, quiet and dark. But the smell of smoke, faint but definite, was now undeniable, a sinister creeping scent seeping from under Mr. Henderson's door, confirming that the initial stages of the disaster were already underway. She raced back to the bathroom, desperate for another glimpse, another detail the mirror might provide. The mirror reflection was no longer a vision, it was a static image, the horrific moment of the fire, frozen in time, like a photograph of doom. But the reflection of Seraphina herself was now looking directly at her, the present Seraphina, her reflective counterpart's expression no longer panicked, but pleading, desperate, her reflected hand pointing not at the raging flames, but down towards the base of the wall, towards the floorboards. Down. It was a clear, unambiguous command from her future self. Seraphina understood. The fire wasn't starting with a kitchen appliance or a careless cigarette at the door. It was starting below, perhaps in the subfloor, or the wall cavity, an old electrical issue, and Mr. Henderson must have been overcome by smoke already, unable to respond to her frantic knocking. She raced back to her own living room, grabbed a heavy antique vase, a hideous, oversized wedding gift she had always hated, but whose density now felt like a godsend, and ran back to the hallway. Ignoring the potential for injury, the sheer madness of her action, she used the vase to smash a small, focused hole through the drywall next to the old man's door, aiming low where the smoke smell was strongest, at the exact spot her reflected self had pointed. A plume of thick, acrid smoke instantly poured out of the hole, a toxic black confirmation of her fear, and the heat intensified dramatically. But as the smoke streamed out, something else happened, the most terrifying event yet. The entire hallway around her seemed to shimmer, the very fabric of her reality buckling. The harsh overhead light in her reality flickered violently and died, plunging the hall into a dim, sickening orange glow that was precisely identical to the light of the fire in the mirror's static image. The temperature around her spiked instantly, not a subtle warmth, but a physical shock of heat, and she could hear the hungry, deep-throated roar of the flames, no longer a vision or a sound from the wall, but an immediate, palpable sound in the air around her, a terrifying reality just a thin wall away. The line between what the mirror showed and what was real had suddenly dissolved, shattered like the reflected glass. She was fully immersed in the impending danger, pulled bodily into the mirror's projected timeline. This was the consequence of fighting back. The mirror's future was not retreating, it was aggressively accelerating to meet her, pulling her into its destructive moment, forcing the issue. Driven by pure survival instinct and the memory of the reflected desperate plea, she used her last ounce of strength, plunging her hand through the jagged, smoking hole, blindly feeling for the source of the heat and the sparks. Her fingers brushed against a thick, frayed wire that was spitting tiny blue sparks, the core of the problem. With a primal yell, she violently ripped it out of the wall, the tearing sound loud in the enclosed space, silencing the dangerous short circuit. The immediate rush of heat seemed to lessen, and the ominous orange glow flickered. Then she focused her terror and pounded on the old man's door with the heavy vase again and again, finally splintering the old wood and breaking the internal lock, forcing the door inward. The apartment was completely dark, thick with smoke, but Mr. Henderson was lying unconscious near the entryway, overcome by the fumes, but thankfully still breathing. Seraphina barely had time to drag his heavy, lifeless body out and down the stairwell, coughing and choking before the fire department arrived, sirens wailing, their arrival a terrifying confirmation of her initial frantic call. They contained the blaze within minutes, which had indeed started in the archaic electrical wiring in the shared wall between the units, just inches from where she had broken the plaster. Mr. Henderson was rushed to the hospital, expected to recover fully but critically ill from smoke inhalation. The chief of the fire department, a grim professional man, told Seraphina that her quick thinking, her incredible decision to smash the wall, had saved the old man's life and prevented the fire from engulfing the entire floor, possibly the entire building. "You bought him the 10 minutes he needed," the chief said, his voice heavy with respect. Exhausted, shaking uncontrollably, and smelling deeply of smoke and ozone, Seraphina sat on the curb outside her building, wrapped in a blanket offered by a neighbor, watching the chaos subside. The future had been terrifyingly close, too close. She had confronted it, and for a heart-stopping few minutes it had enveloped her completely, making her a part of its inevitable tragedy, only for her to rip herself and the old man out of its grasp. When the fire chief was done with his questions, and the initial adrenaline had begun its inevitable, crushing descent, Seraphina walked slowly back up to her apartment, the air still hazy and thick with the scent of water-soaked ash and burnt wood. She walked straight to the bathroom. The mirror was still hanging there, solid and whole, unaffected by the intense heat and chaos just outside its door. The harsh overhead light was back on, flickering faintly, the only remaining sign of the earlier power surge. She looked into the dark glass, bracing herself for another image of terror, another immediate danger, another impossible demand. She saw her reflection, smudged with soot, hair disheveled but undeniably, beautifully alive. The background, though, was subtly different now. It was still the bathroom, but the reflected version of her apartment felt warmer, softer, the harsh light diffused, the peeling wallpaper looking strangely inviting. And then the vision shifted one last time, a final broadcast, and this time there was no panic, no frantic urgency, no threat of violence or fire. Instead of a dangerous event, the mirror showed her a simple, tranquil scene. Her reflection was sitting comfortably on her own couch in her living room, reading a thick book, completely absorbed and at peace. A few minutes later, a man she had never seen before, kind eyes, slightly rumpled clothes, holding a mug, leaned down to kiss the top of her reflected head, smiling at her with quiet affection, a gesture of profound, settled domesticity, a future of calm, of love, of safety. It wasn't the cocktail dress or the glamorous party from the first vision, but it was happy, and it was real. The reflection paused, held that image for a beat longer than usual, allowing her to absorb the profound sense of stability it offered. And then, for the first time since she moved in, the image in the mirror did not snap back to a terrifying version of her present. Instead, the reflected scene slowly, gently began to fade, the colors softening, the light dimming, as if the power source, the battery of the prophecy, had finally run out, leaving the glass completely dark and opaque, a smooth, dead surface. The old pitted mirror, the silent prophet, had fulfilled its purpose. It had shown her the paths of danger, and through her incredible courage, she had chosen the path of light, successfully changing her destiny. The effort had been nearly fatal, but the struggle, the necessary push against the current, had secured her future, a future she could now build, not just endure. Seraphina leaned against the cool porcelain sink, the scent of residual smoke barely noticeable now, replaced by the faint, comforting smell of the old wood and plaster. She was bruised, exhausted, but undeniably, blissfully safe. And finally, truly home in her own time, her own reality. The mirror remained dark, just a solid piece of old glass on the wall, and Seraphina knew she would never look into it the same way again. But she also knew the frantic race was finally, permanently over. A deep, settling calm washed over her, and she smiled, a genuine, earned, happy smile, ready for the peaceful, unprophesied future that lay ahead. And that brings Seraphina's story to a close, a story about the cost of seeing the future and the courage it takes to fight for the present. If you enjoyed this journey into the blurring line between reality and reflection, please remember to subscribe and join our channel. Help us get to 100 subscribers, and if you haven't already, smash that like button. We're aiming for 50 likes on this video. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.